What up, fam? So, is it just a coincidence that I'm wearing my Metallica and Justice for All? This Lady Liberty with her eyes um, tied shut. Um, as we begin our ventures into dystopianism, I will let you decide. So, I will be reading today a story called What's the Difference Between Metal and Flesh by a friend of mine, a Robert Norman, who wrote this while we were in college together. And it has always stuck with me. And so here we go. Pay careful attention because you will have an assignment based on the story after I am done reading. All right? So let's get at it. What's the difference between metal and flesh? It was a question I've been asking in my mind ever since I was born, and I still didn't know what it meant after I asked it out loud. Of course, I still wasn't sure about what being born actually meant either. One thing I knew, though, is that she was my only hope for answers. I was almost frightened into silence, but the question seemed to refuse to go unasked. We both sat in this one cube-shaped, white-walled room. She sat in a chair across from me. I looked at her again, this time studying her carefully. She wasn't very old, as far as I could tell. For a moment I thought she might have been younger than me, but then I thought no, I shouldn't jump to any conclusions. Her face was milk white, like skinless skull. She wore a long white coat and metal glasses that were almost exactly the same color as her face. She opened her clipboard and stabbed herself on the knee with her ballpoint pen. I instinctively flinched, but she stabbed with the wrong end and simply made the point protrude from its hole. She then wrote with the pen without missing a beat. I tried to settle, but her jarring physical motion startled me constantly. At my question, she made a face. I can't describe what it looked like, but it made me think I'd said something wrong. I'll try to answer all of your questions, but I'm going to need you to confirm your basic information first. My heart sank at this. It had already occurred to me that I could remember very little about myself. Name? But this one I knew. My name is Terry Lewis. Date of birth? I don't know, but I'm 27 years old. How can I know how old I am, yet not know my date of birth? Before she could ask that question, I asked my own question with an implicit answer. What year is it? You don't know what year it is, she asked without stopping her writing. No, honestly, I don't. Apparently, she wasn't going to tell me the year. That didn't surprise me, nor did it surprise me that she must have expected me to accept a non-answer. Where are you from? I don't know. Again, she didn't seem affected by my answer. She just wrote in her clipboard, never looking up. Without thinking, I added Reg 750. I thought it might have been an address I remembered. She looked up for a moment, but then returned to her clipboard. I took that to mean what I'd said was either of no interest to her or it didn't make any sense at all. There were a few unnerving moments of flat silence. I spoke words to break the tension. Do you know where I'm from? I asked, trembling. By any chance? She didn't seem to hear me. I thought I was going to have to speak again because the silence was excruciating. But finally she looked up. Her face made a new expression, very different from any previous one. Suddenly she moved different parts of her body at the same time, and it frightened me until I realized she was adjusting herself in her seat. I can't say where you're from. She didn't go back to writing, but she sat and looked at me with an inhuman stillness. The silence grew painful again, so I had to speak. What is this place? I whispered. And why am I here? This is an institution, Mr. Lewis. I was looking down as she spoke, so I couldn't be sure if her lips actually moved. I resolved to take note next time. Am I crazy? She looked at me, still sitting still. We don't know yet, she replied. I was sure this time that her lips didn't move at all. But you're here for your own safety. She seemed to indicate something without motion, and I felt that I almost knew what she meant. For my own safety? Isn't it true, Mr. Lewis, that you hold a strong desire to cut yourself? This caught me by surprise. I hadn't remembered thinking about cutting myself, or if I had, I must have forgotten about it. But actually, she jogged my memory. I did remember the desire to cut myself. But how did she know about this? I never told anyone about it. I would have to think about it for a moment. But luckily, she moved on to another question. You seem constantly afraid. Why is that? What are you afraid of? Good question. So many things. Where do I start? I'm afraid of not knowing who I am. Why wouldn't you know who you are? I I have no memories. This is the earliest thing I can remember is waking up in here, and I don't even know how long ago that was. I don't know where I am. It's like I was just born. How would it be possible for you to be born at 27? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. At this, she went back to her clipboard with her ballpoint pen in an infuriatingly mechanical fashion. After a few moments of writing, she spoke words again. Mr. Lewis, you asked me a very strange question at the beginning of our meeting. What should I infer from that question? Well, I began, then stopped. I remembered the question. The question was still there in the forefront, but I didn't know what it meant until she prompted me. I've got this fear, and I don't know why. She somehow intensified her stare, forcing me to continue. I'm I'm afraid I'm a human being and you are not. She shifted so suddenly and violently in her chair that I thought she was going to attack me. You think you're a human being and I'm not? What do you think I am? With her sharp tone, I was almost afraid to answer. I can't explain it, and I don't know where the idea came from, but it was the first thing on my mind, the first thing I remember knowing. She sat as still and silent as before, but with a sharp, invisible anger. I see. And does this have anything to do with you wanting to cut yourself? I'm not suicidal, I answered reflexively. I didn't readily know why I wanted to cut myself, but the reason suddenly came to me. I want to cut myself to see what I'm made of on the inside. I want to see if I am really metal or flesh, if I live on blood or electricity. Then I'll know what I am. She actually threw her head back and laughed. The abruptness of her piercing laugh and the unsettling contortion of her neck alarmed me, causing me to panic more violently than before. I was certain that I'd said something very, very wrong. So why don't you go ahead, cut yourself, and tell me what you find underneath your skin? As soon as she gave me permission, I was ready. I physically moved to cut myself, but inexplicably, I could not. I didn't even know how to start. I tried with all my might to move, but it seemed to lack the basic faculties, and this terrified me to no end. I looked back to her for an explanation. She didn't give me one, but from the look on her face, she definitely knew something I did not. Would you like to cut me to see what's underneath? Her question penetrated deep into me and caused a deranged, buzzing exhilaration. I wanted to say yes. I'd like to cut you as hard as I can and see what's inside of you, because I'll know you're not human when I see the wiring spill from your body. But I only replied, no. She smiled, as if she knew what I wanted to say and was pleased she could intimidate me into keeping quiet. But she couldn't stop my imagination. I cut her anyway. I imagined a sharp object nearby, but even imagining, I could not cut myself, so I cut her instead. Since I already knew we were different, I'd be able to find out what I am by what she is. But results are the limit of imagination. I couldn't tell if it was blood or electricity beneath her skin, but I could only think she was indeed the artificial one, because her exaggerated physical motions could not be natural. They're surely a sign of imitation. She suddenly roused me from my daydream by speaking words. I promptly bandaged her wound and listened once more. Since you were only just born, let me let you in on a little secret. There is no difference between us. Her eyes widened, zoomed in on me. While trying to appear calm, I looked around for something sharp, anything sharp, to perform a physical duplicate of my imaginary action, but there was nothing to be found. She didn't seem concerned in the least, so she must have known that she was in no danger. She removed her glasses and locked her neck and the focus of her eyes into a seemingly programmed position towards me. Metal or flesh makes no difference, Mr. Lewis. The flattest, coldest metal is equivalent to the flattest, coldest skin. Likewise, the most pliant metal behaves in the exact same manner as the most supple skin. If you slice your wrist with a knife, you might as well be slicing a knife with your wrist. Steel or bone makes no difference. The hardest steel and the hardest bone are only negligible in their discrepancy. When you break your hip, you have a replacement augmented. Whether the hip is bone and the replacement is metal, or vice versa, is an unnecessary and unanswerable question. Electricity or blood makes no difference. The mass and energy of both are exactly identical. They work the same way and are completely interchangeable. Christ's blood can be measured in amperes, just as my electrical bill can be measured in pints. There is no difference. Whether you give blood or conserve electricity, you're performing the same action. The question of organic or mechanic is not as simple as metal or flesh, and it's impossible to reduce people to a sum of their parts. You think of computers and VCRs as tools because it is easier than thinking of them as slaves. And it is hard to admit that you are the same thing they are. When she finished, she sat still, of course. She looked at me in continuous automatic focus, and I looked back at her. I no longer searched the room frantically for a sharp object. I could only sit at her as her explanation painfully thawed in my brain. I looked at her with everything she had said in mind. Truly, her face could be interpreted as either metal or flesh. It was impossible to tell the difference. I looked to her skin and saw the potential imaginary cut created by my non-existent sharp object. I carefully pulled back the hypothetical bandage, and the wound was neither blood nor electricity, but simply dried energy spilled from a theoretical laceration. I looked back to her again and saw more of myself than I'd originally realized, and it took only her words to make the difference. Although I knew no answers to my questions had all been necessarily answered. Do you understand, Mr. Lewis? I looked away solemnly, paying all due reverence to her. I hope she didn't realize the full depth of my previous psychosis, and if she did, I hoped she wouldn't hold it against me. Most of all, I hoped she didn't feel any real pain from her imaginary wound. Yes, I understand. I regret my insensitivity, and I regret my insanity. At this she sat, muted. And just when my apparition began to regenerate, she gave a new expression, one I'd never seen before. More importantly, her mood changed. She actually seemed pleased. I do enjoy our talks. You're getting better and better every time. I felt another stab of emotion, only this time it was positive anxiety. She got up from her chair and I almost fainted. The action seemed unprecedented, but luckily she had put me somewhat at ease before she rose. She walked over to me in a complicated sequence of movements that I tried to ignore for my own sanity. When she finally stood in front of me, I fully saw her eyes for the first time. They weren't deep human windows, but bleak, colorless walls. She reached out her hand, and I remained calm, anticipating the telling moment. When she touched me, to my horror, I instantly realized my true shape and nature and why I couldn't cut myself when I wanted to. It was as if my sharp, square edges didn't exist until her fingers created them. I felt real sensations I'd never known before, but they were wrong, completely, horribly wrong. Very good, Terry. I feel so much better. I didn't know how to respond. I throbbed with fury, yet I had no physical mode to exercise that fury. She lied to me. She told me we were the same, but we were not. She dared me to cut myself, knowing fully that appliances cannot possibly engage in self injury. I seethed. I quivered, but I could do nothing. I sat, a naive rectangle, desperately formulating one final, decisive effort to exact revenge. But the last thing I realized is that her hand controlled my only button. She pushed its metal surface with her flesh finger and silenced me before I ever made a voluntary noise. Real Human Emotion and Dependency Journal will now reset. Thank you for using. Oh no, thank you. If it weren't for you, I'd be talking to myself. I know I shouldn't use the psychology equipment for my own entertainment, but it's too much fun. Let's start over. Same name, same age, same anxiety level, same question. The first thing I felt was fear, and I couldn't remember anything except my name is Terry Lewis. I'm 27 years old. I'm 27 years old, yet it feels like I've just been born. How is that possible? I saw her for the first time sitting across from me. Who is she? Will she help me? Does she know who I am? I was immediately aware of the acute silence, and it caused me to falter. I knew instinctively that there was a difference between her and me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I wanted her to speak first, but I felt compelled to ask a persistent, curious question.